The gun was already cocked when Edna Gentry realized she had been played for a fool. She stood in the middle of the Copper Ridge saloon, her dress dusty from 3 days of hard riding, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, and her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her back teeth. Across the warped floorboards, Fletcher Holt leveled his revolver at her chest and smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won. "You thought you could just walk into my town and take what's mine," Fletcher said, his voice as smooth and cold as a river stone in January. "Thought that piece of paper in your pocket meant something out here." Edna's fingers tightened around the folded document she had ridden 400 miles to deliver. The deed to the Gentry ranch, her father's land, her birthright, the single most important thing left in her life now that her father was 3 weeks in the ground and she had nothing else to cling to in this world. "It means everything," she said, and her voice did not shake because Edna Gentry had decided somewhere around the second night of sleeping on cold prairie ground that she would not allow herself to be frightened again. "It's legal, registered in Santa Fe, and you know it." Fletcher took a step toward her. The saloon was dead quiet. 6 of his men sat at the card tables and not one of them moved. The barkeep had already disappeared behind his counter. Edna was entirely alone in the center of the room, and she understood with sudden crystalline clarity that she was about to discover exactly what kind of woman she was. Then the door behind her opened. The footsteps that came through it were unhurried, measured. The kind of footsteps that belonged to a man who had walked into dangerous rooms before and come out the other side intact. Edna did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Fletcher's gun and listened. "Afternoon, Holt," said a voice that was low and even and carried the particular weight of a man who chose his words carefully because he understood their cost. "You always point iron at unarmed women, or is this a special occasion?" Fletcher's smile faltered, just slightly, just enough. "Sheridan," he said, "this doesn't concern you." "Well," said the voice behind Edna, and she heard boots cross the floorboards until a figure appeared at the very edge of her peripheral vision. "I reckon I'll be the one to decide that." Lionel Sheridan stepped into full view, and Edna finally allowed herself to look at him. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked rather than merely ate, with dark eyes set beneath the brim of a weathered hat. He wore a Marshal's badge on his coat, though the coat itself had seen better years, and his hand rested at his side with the careful stillness of a man who had not drawn yet but could. She did not know him. She had never seen him before in her life. But in that moment, with Fletcher Holt's gun pointed at her heart and 6 hired men at her back, Lionel Sheridan was the most welcome sight she had ever encountered in 26 years of living. And that was where it truly began. Though to understand why either of them had arrived in Copper Ridge on that particular afternoon in the autumn of 1882, you had to go back several weeks, to a woman alone at a kitchen table, and a man who had ridden 300 miles to find something he had lost. Edna had grown up on the Gentry Ranch, 40 miles south of Santa Fe, in the high desert country, where the grass grew in dry clumps between red rock formations, and the wind never quite stopped moving. Her father, Thomas Gentry, had built the ranch from nothing in 1856, hauling water and breaking sod with his own hands until the place became something worth keeping. He had raised Edna alone after her mother died of fever when Edna was 7, and the two of them had managed the cattle and the land and the bookkeeping together for nearly 2 decades. Thomas Gentry was not a man who made enemies easily. He was honest in his dealings, fair to his cowhands, and slow to anger. But the land he sat on had become valuable in a way he had not anticipated, because the railroad was coming through New Mexico territory, and Fletcher Holt, who controlled half the county commission and all of the local law, had decided that the Gentry Ranch sat exactly where he wanted it. The pressure had started 3 years before Thomas died. Holt's men had cut fences. His cattle had gone missing. A grass fire had destroyed the south pasture. Thomas had written letters to the territorial governor that went unanswered, and he had taken his deed to 3 different lawyers who had each told him the paperwork was sound before finding reasons to stop representing him. Edna had watched her father age 10 years in 3. She had watched a strong man become a tired one, and then a sick one, and then a man lying in a narrow bed with his breathing coming in shallow pulls, holding her hand and telling her with his last clear voice that the deed was in the iron box under the floorboard in his study, and that she should not let them take it. She had promised him she would not. She had spent 4 days after the funeral settling what affairs could be settled, arranging for their 2 remaining cowhands to keep the cattle together, and then she had taken the deed from the iron box, sewn it into the lining of her traveling bag as a precaution, and ridden north toward Copper Ridge, because Copper Ridge was where the county land office was, and she intended to have the deed officially re-registered under her own name before Fletcher Holt could fabricate a competing claim. She had not expected Holt to be waiting for her when she arrived. She had underestimated him. She understood that now, standing in his saloon with his gun pointed at her. He had known she was coming. He had spies or simply friends, and the word had traveled faster than she had. Lionel Sheridan had arrived in Copper Ridge 4 days before Edna, though his reasons for being there had nothing to do with land deeds or cattle ranches, at least not initially. He had been appointed territorial marshal 18 months earlier, a position he had taken with some ambivalence, because ambivalence was something Lionel Sheridan had become very good at after a decade of work that had asked more of him than he had sometimes been willing to give. He was 32 years old and had been a lawman of one kind or another since he was 22, first as a deputy in Kansas, then as a range detective for a cattle association in Colorado, then in a brief and unsuccessful interlude as a private citizen trying to run a horse operation outside of Albuquerque that had collapsed when his business partner absconded with their operating capital. That partner's name was a thing he did not say aloud anymore. The betrayal of it had left a mark on him that he mostly kept hidden, the way a man keeps a scar under his sleeve not because he is ashamed of it, but because he is tired of explaining it. He had taken the marshal's job because it was offered, and because he was good at it, and because the alternative was becoming the kind of man who sat in a saloon waiting for someone to give him a reason to get up. His assignment in Copper Ridge was officially listed as an investigation into land fraud and judicial corruption, because a territorial judge in Santa Fe had received 4 separate written complaints about Fletcher Holt's activities in the county, and had finally decided that someone should look at them. Lionel had ridden north with a thin file of documents and no particular expectation of making quick progress, because men like Holt were usually careful and usually protected, and the work of dismantling them was usually slow. He had been in Copper Ridge for 4 days, staying quietly at the hotel and drinking coffee in the mornings at the cafe across from the land office, watching the patterns of who went where and when, before Edna Gentry rode into town on a gray horse with her bag strapped across the saddle and walked directly into the wolf's den. He had seen her come in. He had noted the set of her shoulders and the way she carried herself, upright and deliberate, the way a person carries themselves when they are frightened but have decided to move anyway. He had seen her go into the saloon and known, with the instinct of a man who had spent 10 years reading situations, that it was about to go badly. He had gone in after her because it was the right thing to do, and because in the 4 days he had spent in Copper Ridge accumulating information about Fletcher Holt, a woman riding alone with documents in her bag and heading straight for the man's territory fit neatly into the pattern he had already assembled. "The lady is going to walk out of here," Lionel said, standing in the saloon with his hand still resting loose at his side, his eyes on Fletcher Holt, "and she's going to do it with whatever she came in carrying. You've got no jurisdiction over a private matter between 2 citizens," Holt said, though the gun had dipped an inch, which Lionel noted. Pointing a gun at someone in a public establishment is not a private matter, Lionel said, and I've got plenty of jurisdiction over that. The silence stretched. One of Holt's men at the card table shifted in his chair. Lionel did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Holt because the man with the gun was the only one who mattered right now, and looking away would be read as weakness, and weakness in a room like this one could get you killed. Holt lowered the gun, not because he was afraid, Lionel understood, but because he was calculating. A man like Holt did not survive by being reckless. He survived by being patient. "This isn't finished," Holt said, looking at Edna. "No," Edna said quietly. "It is not." She turned and walked toward the door, and Lionel stepped back to let her pass, and then followed her out into the hard afternoon light of Copper Ridge's Main Street, where the wind was blowing dust in long horizontal sheets, and the town went about its business as though nothing had happened inside the saloon at all. On the boardwalk outside, Edna stopped walking and put her hand against the post of the awning, and stood there for a moment with her back to him. Her shoulders rose and fell with one long breath. Then she turned around. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something she was working hard to keep contained. "That was going to end very differently without you." "Probably," Lionel said. He studied her face, which was striking in the way of women who spend time outdoors, the kind of beauty that was structural and lasting rather than delicate. She had dark eyes and a firm jaw and a mouth that suggested she was more accustomed to saying necessary things than pleasant ones. "You want to tell me what you were carrying in there?" She looked at him for a moment, assessing. He was wearing a badge, but badges in this part of the territory could mean many things, and she had learned in the last 3 years to be careful about who she trusted. "Who are you?" she asked. "Lionel Sheridan. Territorial Marshal out of Santa Fe." Something shifted in her expression, not quite relief, more like a cautious recalibration. "Edna Gentry," she said. "My family owns a ranch 40 miles south of here, and I have a deed that proves it, and Fletcher Holt intends to take it from me." "I know who Fletcher Holt is," Lionel said. "I've been here 4 days building a case against him." She stared at him. "4 days," she repeated. "While he's been stealing land and threatening people for 3 years. "The territorial court moves at its own pace," Lionel said, and he heard the inadequacy of the words even as he said them because she was right, and the slow machinery of official justice was cold comfort to a woman who had just had a gun pointed at her chest. "My father is dead," Edna said, quietly and directly, the way someone says a thing that still costs them something to say. "He spent 3 years fighting this, and it killed him. I am not going to lose his land." Lionel looked at her for another moment. The wind moved a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back without breaking eye contact. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." They sat in the small dining room of the hotel, which was the only place in Copper Ridge that was not under Holt's direct influence, at least as far as Lionel had been able to determine. The proprietress, a spare woman named Mrs. Alcott, who wore her gray hair in a tight braid and had opinions about everything she did not share unless pressed, brought them coffee without being asked and retreated to the kitchen. Edna told him everything. She told it the way she seemed to do most things, efficiently and without unnecessary ornamentation. But the grief was present in the architecture of the story, visible in the way she paused before mentioning her father and the way she held her coffee cup without drinking from it. She described 3 years of systematic harassment, the fence cutting, the cattle loss, the grass fire, the lawyers who had turned away. She described the deed, which she produced from the lining of her bag with a small knife she used to open the stitching, and laid on the table between them. Lionel examined it. It was legitimate. He had seen enough land documents to know the difference between a genuine registered deed and a fabrication, and this one was real, with the proper territorial seal and registration number and the signature of a recorder's clerk in Santa Fe. "This is solid," he said. "I know it is," Edna said. "The problem is getting it re-registered under my name before Holt files a competing claim. I was going to the county land office this morning, but apparently he knew I was coming." He has people on the roads, Lionel said. I've noticed that. So what do? She said, and the we was clearly deliberate. She had decided, in the hour since he had walked into the saloon, that he was trustworthy enough to include in her plans, and he found that he respected the decisiveness of it. The county land office is Holt's, Lionel said. Filing there won't accomplish anything today. But the territorial land registry in Santa Fe supersedes the county office, and I can send a wire through the Federal Telegraph at the Army relay station 12 miles east of here, requesting a direct registration lock while the investigation is pending. Edna considered this. How long does that take? If I send it this afternoon, I could have confirmation by tomorrow morning. And in the meantime, Lionel said, I'd suggest not being alone anywhere in this town. The look she gave him was dry and composed. I am alone in this town, she said. I rode here by myself. I have no one else. You have me, Lionel said, and then heard how that sounded and added, as an officer of the territory. Something at the corner of her mouth moved barely, not quite a smile. How reassuring, she said. They spent the rest of that afternoon working. Lionel sent his wire from the Army relay station, riding the 12 miles with Edna beside him because he was not willing to leave her in town, and she was not willing to stay. The ride was quiet at first, both of them attending to the landscape with the particular alertness of people who have reason to be careful, watching the ridgelines and the dry creek beds for movement. After a while, when the silence had settled into something more comfortable than tense, Edna said, How long have you been a marshal? 18 months in this position, Lionel said. Before that, various other things in the same general line of work. Do you like it? He thought about the question seriously, which seemed to surprise her slightly. I'm good at it, he said finally. That's not quite the same thing, but it's what I've got. What would you do otherwise? She asked. If you weren't doing this. I had a horse operation outside Albuquerque for a while, he said. That didn't work out. He did not elaborate, and she did not press, which he appreciated. She had the sense to understand that some answers were as complete as a man was prepared to make them. I would have kept running the ranch, she said, answering the question in reverse. I always intended to. My father and I talked about it. He wanted to expand the herd, bring in a better bull stock from Texas. We had plans. She paused. He got sick before we could execute them. I'm sorry about your father, Lionel said, and meant it simply and without inflation. Thank you, she said in the same register. He was a good man, the kind of man who should have been protected by the law of the territory he had lived in for 30 years. She said this without accusation in her voice, but he felt the weight of it anyway. You're right, he said. He should have been. She looked at him. Most men in your position would explain why it's complicated, she said. It is complicated, Lionel said. That doesn't make you wrong. At the relay station, a young Army corporal received Lionel's message and promised to transmit it within the hour. Lionel wrote out the details of the registration lock request in careful legal language, citing his investigatory authority and the specific document number on Edna's deed, and they rode back to town in the long slanted light of late afternoon. He noticed, on the ride back, that she sat a horse exceptionally well, not in the showy way of someone who has been trained to ride, but in the deeply natural way of someone who has done it every day of their life as a matter of necessity. She and the gray mare moved together with a kind of quiet agreement. They ate dinner in the hotel dining room. Mrs. Alcott produced a reasonable beef stew and cornbread, and they ate across from each other at the small table. And the conversation that happened over that meal was the kind that happens when two people discover, with some surprise, that the other person is more interesting than expected. Edna asked him about Kansas, where he had been a deputy in the late 1870s, and he told her about the cattle towns, the wildness of them, the sense of being at the edge of something enormous that was moving too fast to fully see. She told him about growing up on the ranch, the particular silence of the high desert, the way the stars looked from the roof of the main house on clear nights. She said her father had taught her to read by the age of 5 and had kept a small but serious library which she had read entirely twice by the time she was 15. "What did you read?" Lionel asked. "Everything," she said. "Dickens, Spanish histories, a legal reference text that I'm fairly sure was meant for lawyers rather than ranch children but which has proven extremely useful." She said this with the first real smile he had seen from her, brief and self-aware. "The deed," he said. "I knew exactly what I had," she said, and the smile faded back into the steady, composed expression she wore most of the time. "And I knew exactly what he was trying to do. I just didn't have the means to stop him fast enough." "You have the means now," Lionel said. She looked at him across the table in the warm flicker of the lamp. "I'm not accustomed to relying on other people," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I tend to manage things on my own." "I've noticed," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "I prefer people who know what they're doing." Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the town with a low, searching sound. From somewhere down the street came the distant sound of the saloon, music and voices, Holt's world going on as it always had. Lionel thought about the file he had been building, the 4 days of careful observation, and how Edna's arrival had accelerated everything, forced it into a confrontation before he was quite ready, but also clarified it in a way that slow, patient work sometimes failed to do. He walked her to the door of her room that night, which was the last room at the end of the hotel corridor. He had taken the room directly adjacent. "I'll be right there," he said, nodding at the door. "If anything happens." "I'm not going to fall apart in the night," she said, not unkindly. "I didn't think you would," he said, "but Holt might do something stupid and I'd rather be close." She considered this and then nodded. "Good night, Marshal Sheridan," she said. "Good night, Miss Gentry," he said. She went inside and he heard the bolt slide home, and he stood there for a moment in the corridor, and he did not examine too closely why he remained there a moment longer than strictly necessary before going to his own room. The confirmation wire from Santa Fe arrived the following morning before breakfast. Lionel brought it to Edna's door, and she read it standing in the corridor in her traveling dress, her hair not yet fully pinned. The wire confirmed that a registration lock had been placed on the Gentry Ranch deed, pending the outcome of the territorial investigation, which meant that no competing claim could be filed or processed until the lock was lifted by the territorial marshal's authority. Edna read it twice. Then she looked up. "This is real," she said. "It's real," Lionel said. She pressed her lips together for a moment, and he watched her work through some complex internal movement that resolved itself into controlled relief. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that in the full measure of what it is." "You're not out of it yet," he said, because he owed her honesty. "Holt will find ways to challenge the lock. He has lawyers and he has connections. This buys you time, not a final resolution." "Time is what I need," she said. "Time and evidence." "That's what I'm here for," he said. "The evidence." They had breakfast together in the dining room, and over coffee and eggs Lionel explained to her the shape of the case he was building against Fletcher Holt. He had documented testimony from 2 former county commissioners who had been pressured to vote on land transfers favorable to Holt. He had financial records, obtained through the Army mail and the banking correspondent in Santa Fe, that showed money moving through Holt's accounts in patterns consistent with bribes. He had the records of 6 land transfers in the county that followed the same pattern as the pressure being applied to the Gentry Ranch. What he lacked was a witness who would testify publicly. The former commissioners would talk in private but were too frightened to appear before a judge. The other landowners had mostly already capitulated, selling at Holt's price or disappearing from the county. "What would change that?" Edna asked. "If Holt does something overt," Lionel said. "Something I can witness directly and document. Something that's clearly criminal rather than simply unethical." "He pointed a gun at me yesterday," Edna said. "With 6 witnesses who work for him and no one else in the room," Lionel said. "I was there but I walked in after. What I can testify to is that the gun was drawn, not that he threatened you specifically." Edna nodded slowly, thinking. "He's going to come after the ranch," she said. He knows I'm here. He knows I've filed paperwork, but the ranch itself is 40 miles away with 2 cowhands and nobody to defend it. Lionel saw it the same instant she did. He'll move on the property while you're here, Lionel said. While I'm occupied and absent, Edna said. Yes, he's smart enough to do that. They looked at each other across the table. I need to go back, she said. I'll come with you, he said. She looked at him carefully. Your investigation is here, she said. My investigation is about Fletcher Holt, he said. And if he sends men to seize your property illegally while I'm 12 miles away at an army telegraph station sending wires, I've lost the best piece of direct evidence I'm going to get. I need to be where the action is going to be. She studied him for another moment, and he had the feeling again of being assessed with a precision that most people did not apply to him. You also just don't want me riding 40 miles alone with his men on the roads, she said. That too, he admitted. They rode south that same morning, and the journey took the better part of the day, because the road was rough in the upper section, and they moved carefully through the areas where the canyon walls closed in and visibility was limited. Lionel rode with his rifle across his saddle bow, not conspicuously, but present. They talked through most of the ride, which surprised him, because he was not habitually talkative on the trail and had assumed she would not be either, given the practical seriousness with which she seemed to approach everything. But there was something about the open space of the high desert, the red rock and the dry sage and the enormous sky, that seemed to loosen the careful economy of her conversation. She told him about the ranch in real detail, the way its sections were laid out, the quality of the grass in the east pasture, the spring that ran reliably in the northeast corner of the property, and that her father had called the best feature of the land. She talked about the cattle with the fluency of someone who had grown up, understanding them as both livelihood and responsibility. He told her more about his years as a range detective, which had been interesting work, tracking stolen cattle across 3 states and learning to read the land as a record of what had passed over it. He told her about the long, empty stretches of those journeys, the weeks of riding through country that had no name yet, the occasional sense of existing at the very edge of a world that was still becoming itself. Do you think it's changing? She asked. The West, I mean. What it was. Already changed, he said. The railroad changes everything it touches. The telegraph changes everything it touches. It'll be something different in 10 years. Not better or worse necessarily, just different. My father thought it would be better, she said. He believed in progress, in the idea that things improved over time. He came here from Tennessee in 1856 with almost nothing, and he built something real, and he thought that was the promise of the place. That honest work was enough. It wasn't enough, Lionel said. No, she said. It wasn't. They were quiet for a while after that, riding side by side through the long afternoon with the sun behind them and the shadow of the mesa lying cool and blue across the trail. He was right to believe it, though, Lionel said eventually. The problem isn't the promise. The problem is the men who exploit the gap between the promise and the reality. She looked at him. The light was getting long and golden, and it was doing something to her face that he noticed with a kind of care that was becoming less impersonal by the hour. That's the most philosophical thing you've said all day, she observed. I have my moments, he said. She smiled, the real one, the brief self-aware one that he was starting to recognize as her genuine version of warmth, and he felt something in his chest move sideways in a way that was not strictly professional. They arrived at the Gentry ranch as the sun was touching the horizon, and the sight of it stopped Edna mid-step as she swung down from her horse. It was intact. No smoke, no broken gates. The house stood square and solid in its hollow among the red rocks, the barn to one side, the corral holding a small gather of cattle. From the bunkhouse a light was burning. One of the cowhands, a weathered man named Ruiz who had worked for Thomas Gentry for 7 years, came out to meet them. Miss Edna, he said with evident relief. We were watching for trouble. Has anyone come? She asked. 2 riders came by this morning, Ruiz said. sat on the ridge for maybe an hour looking down. Then they left. Lionel filed that away. They were counting, he said quietly to Edna, assessing. Then they'll come tonight or tomorrow, she said. Maybe, he said. Or they'll wait until they have a legal pretext. Holt doesn't do things openly if he can do them behind paperwork. He pointed a gun at me openly yesterday, she said. That was a mistake, Lionel said. I suspect he knew it the moment I walked in. He'll be more careful now. They settled the horses and went inside the ranch house, which was low-ceilinged and practical, furnished with the plain solidity of things chosen for use rather than appearance. There was a large stone fireplace, a good kitchen table, bookshelves along the wall of the main room exactly as she had described them, containing a remarkable collection for a ranch in the New Mexico territory. Edna moved through the rooms with the particular quality of someone reasserting their ownership of a space, touching things lightly as she passed them, opening windows to let in the evening air. Lionel stood in the main room and looked at the books. "Which one is the legal reference text?" he asked. She came to stand beside him, closer than was strictly necessary given the width of the shelf, and pointed to a thick volume bound in brown cloth with the spine reading Treatise on American Property Law, 4th edition. "I read it when I was 13, she said. "I understood about half of it. More than most lawyers," he said. He was aware of how close she was. The room was warm and quiet and smelled of cedar and old paper, and he stayed very still for a moment because he was not sure what to do with the particular awareness that was building in him, slow and certain as water finding its level. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said. "I don't want Ruiz to think. Ruiz has known me since I was 12 years old," she said. "He'll think whatever is accurate, which is that a territorial marshal is here protecting federal evidence from an extortion operation." She paused. "But you may sleep in the barn if it's more comfortable for you." "It's not more comfortable," he said, "but it's more appropriate." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at most things, without evasion. "Appropriate is for people who have other options," she said. "We have one spare room, which was my father's. You're welcome to it." He accepted, because she was right about the pragmatics of it, and because he was honest enough with himself to admit that the part about it being more comfortable was the more operative of the two reasons he had given. He woke in the night to the sound of a horse, distant and then closer, and was dressed and at the window in under a minute with his rifle in his hands. He stood there listening. The sound moved around to the east side of the property and then stopped. In the morning there were fresh tracks on the east side of the corral fence. One horse walking slowly, not approaching the house, circling. Ruiz looked at the tracks and said nothing, which was the way of a man who had lived this kind of tension long enough that he had given up annotating it. Edna looked at the tracks too, crouching down with her skirt pooled in the dust around her, examining the depth and the shape. "One rider," she said. "Heavy, big horse." "Marking the layout," Lionel said. "For whoever comes next." "When?" she said. "Soon," he said. "Now that the registration lock is in place, he knows his window is closing. If he's going to do something, he has to do it before the territorial investigation builds enough to bring formal charges. So we wait," she said, standing up. "We wait," he said, "and we document everything." The next 3 days had a quality that Edna would think about later as both the most frightening and, in a way she could not explain cleanly, the most fully alive she had felt in years. The threat was real and present, and Holt's surveillance was constant. Riders appearing on the ridge above the property at irregular intervals. A legal notice delivered by a county deputy claiming a survey dispute over the east boundary, which Lionel countered with a written response citing federal precedents and the territorial lock. But alongside the fear and the tension was something else, something generated by the proximity of two people working toward the same goal under the same roof, eating breakfast across from each other, riding the property together in the afternoons to inspect the fence lines and check the cattle, sitting by the fireplace in the evenings with Edna reading and Lionel writing up his case notes. On the second evening she put down her book and said, "Tell me about the horse operation, the one that failed." He looked up from his notes. Why, he said. Because you mentioned it once and then clearly didn't want to elaborate on it, she said. And I've been curious about what put that particular expression on your face when you said it. He set down his pen. My business partner stole our operating capital, he said. A man I had known for 6 years and trusted completely. He took everything and left the territory, and I spent 4 months trying to find him before I decided that 4 months was already too much of my life to give to it. Did you find him eventually? No, he said, and I made peace with that. She was looking at him steadily. That's the dark past expression, she said. The one you're wearing right now. Everyone has a dark past expression, he said. What was his name, she asked. Ben Harcourt, he said. The name came out flat and final, stripped of whatever pain it might once have carried. Do you trust people easily now, she asked. After that. No, he said, but I trust people accurately, which is better. Is that why you haven't asked me something you clearly want to ask? He raised an eyebrow. What do I clearly want to ask? Whether there's anyone who should know I'm here, she said. Anyone who would have an opinion about me staying under the same roof as a marshal they've never met. He looked at her for a moment. Is there? He said. No, she said. There was someone 2 years ago, but the ranch work and the situation with Holt was more than he wanted to accommodate. She said it without particular bitterness, simply as information. And you? No one since before the horse operation, he said, which tells you something about the sequence of events. It tells me that losing the business and losing the person happened around the same time, she said, which is a great deal to absorb. Yes, he said. It was. She picked up her book again, but she did not immediately begin reading. She sat there with it open in her lap and said, quietly and without looking at him, I'm glad you walked into that saloon. So am I, he said. Miss Gentry, you could call me Edna, she said, given the circumstances. Edna, he said. It was a sensible name, a grounded name, a name that suited her entirely. Lionel, she said, trying it out, and looked at him over the top of her book with that brief, real smile. On the 3rd day they came. There were 9 of them, which was more than Lionel had expected for what was supposed to be a legal land seizure. And they rode in from the South Road in the early afternoon, with a man in front carrying a paper that he announced was a county court order declaring an emergency possession due to disputed ownership. Lionel came out onto the porch before Edna could, which she later told him she had found both unnecessary and, in retrospect, appreciated. Show me the order, he said. The man in front, who was not Fletcher Holt but one of his lawyers, a thin, dry figure named Cass who had ridden up from town, presented the paper. Lionel read it without expression. This is a county court order, Lionel said. Issued by Judge Brennan, who is under investigation by the Territorial Marshal's office for conflict of interest relating to Fletcher Holt's land dealings. He looked up, which means this order is issued by a compromised judicial officer and has no force against a federal registration lock. The county court, Cass began, is subordinate to territorial authority, Lionel said, which is subordinate to federal authority under which this property is currently registered and protected. You can ride back to Copper Ridge and explain to Mr. Holt why you didn't bring more paperwork. Cass looked at the 9 riders behind him, then at Lionel, then at the badge. This isn't over, Cass said. No, Lionel said. It'll be over in a federal courtroom in Santa Fe in about 6 weeks, I expect. They rode away. Edna was standing in the doorway behind him when he turned. Ruiz was at the corner of the barn. The other cowhand, a young man named Pete, was visible at the corral gate. 6 weeks in a federal courtroom, Edna said. Give or take, Lionel said. What happens to the ranch while we wait? I'm going to need to stay, he said. I hope that's acceptable. She looked at him with an expression that had in it now something more than the careful assessment of the previous days, something that had softened around the edges, not into weakness but into something more open. It's acceptable, she said. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that rearrange a person. Lionel had not intended to become part of the Gentry ranch's daily life. He had intended to maintain the professional clarity of a territorial officer doing his job. But the ranch required hands, and Ruiz and Pete were stretched thin, and Lionel had grown up working before he ever became a lawman. And so he found himself mending fence in the mornings and riding the south boundary in the afternoons and helping bring a stray group of cattle back from the canyon country east of the property on a Tuesday that turned into a 12-hour day. He worked well with his hands, which Edna seemed to notice, and she told him on a Wednesday evening as they sat on the porch with the stars coming out above the mesa that she had not expected that. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A man who gives orders," she said, "based on the badge." "I gave orders when I needed to," he said. "That afternoon in the saloon." "You spoke with authority," she said. "That's different, is it?" "People who give orders need other people to comply," she said. "People who speak with authority mean what they say and let the situation follow. My father was like that." He absorbed the comparison and found it meaningful in a way he did not immediately know how to respond to. "You talk about him a lot," he said. "You don't apologize for it, which I appreciate." "He was the most important person in my life for 25 years, she said simply. "It would be strange not to talk about him." "Who do you have now?" he asked. "Family, I mean." "A cousin in Missouri I've corresponded with twice," she said. "No one else." She looked at the stars. "I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm describing the situation accurately." "I know," he said. "I have a sister in Kansas. We write. My parents are gone." "Then we're both accurately describing the same situation," she said. "More or less," he said. The lamp inside the house was casting a low, warm light through the window, and the night was cool in the way of the high desert, with a clarity to the air that made the darkness feel expansive rather than close. Edna had her hands folded in her lap, and she was not looking at him now but at the mesa. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "When this is over," she said, "when the case is finished and whatever happens in Santa Fe happens, what do you do after?" "Go back to Santa Fe," he said. "Continue the work." "And then?" He looked at her. The question was small and enormous at the same time. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I haven't thought much about after." "I think about it constantly," she said. "The ranch is the after. Getting the ranch safe is not the end of the story, it's the beginning. There's so much work to do. The herd needs building. The east pasture needs a new fence line. The spring needs clearing. There's 5 years of deferred plans." She paused. "I think about that." "As you should," he said. "I think about it with someone else in the picture," she said, and now she looked at him directly with that clear, steady gaze. "I don't know who, but I noticed the shape of the gap." He was very still. "Edna," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said immediately. "I wasn't asking you to fill the gap. I was being honest about how I'm thinking. I thought you deserved honesty, given that you've been living in my father's room for 3 weeks and mending my fences." "I wasn't going to say something polite and dismiss the question," he said. "I was going to say that I think about it too." She looked at him. "The after," she said. "And the shape of the gap," he said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sitting with something true that has just been said, letting it settle. He reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his, carefully, with the same care he applied to most things. She turned her hand over under his and held it, and they sat like that on the porch of the Gentry ranch under a sky full of stars and said nothing else for a long while. It was another week before he kissed her. It happened in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, with no particular architecture to the moment. She was pouring coffee, and he came in from checking the horses, and she handed him the cup and their hands met around the handle, and they stood there with 2 inches between them and the morning light coming in from the window above the basin. He kissed her gently and with the full attention of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting for it, and she kissed him back with the straightforward certainty that characterized everything she did, and when they stopped, they were both smiling in the quiet, private way of people who have surprised themselves by arriving at something inevitable. "I should have done that a week ago," he said. 2 weeks ago," she said, and took her coffee and went to start breakfast without further ceremony, which made him smile all the way through scrambled eggs and biscuits. The case came together in the 6th week, just as Lionel had estimated. A deputy court clerk from Copper Ridge arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, with documents demonstrating that Fletcher Holt had paid Judge Brennan $4,000 to issue 3 fraudulent land seizure orders over the previous 2 years, including the one that had been attempted on the Gentry Ranch. The clerk, whose name was Walter Greer, and who was a nervous young man of 24 who had clearly been losing sleep over what he knew, had decided that the registration lock and the federal investigation meant that the tide was turning, and had brought what he had directly to Lionel. Lionel spent the entire afternoon with Greer's documents and his own accumulated files, building the final formal complaint to be submitted to the territorial court in Santa Fe. Edna sat at the kitchen table across from him and helped, because her reading of the legal reference text had proven to be exactly as useful as he had suspected, and she had a sharp eye for logical inconsistencies in the financial records. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and at some point, Ruiz brought in a pot of coffee and retreated again with the tact of a man who has lived long enough to recognize when 2 people are doing important work together. "This is enough," Edna said near 9 o'clock, setting down a ledger page. "This is more than enough." "Yes," Lionel said. "I'll ride to the relay station tomorrow and send everything. The territorial court will issue an arrest warrant within the week." She looked at the pile of documents between them, and something in her face moved through several things he watched pass across it: relief, grief, exhaustion, and something that resolved finally into a kind of fierce, quiet satisfaction. "My father should have seen this," she said. "He knew you would do it," Lionel said. "He told you exactly where the deed was." She looked at him. "He left it for me to handle," she said, "because he believed I could." "He was right," Lionel said. She nodded just once, accepting the fact of it. He sent the documents the following morning, and in the afternoon rode into Copper Ridge to inform Fletcher Holt officially that a complaint had been filed with the territorial court, and that pending the warrant, he was advised to remain in the county. He found Holt in his saloon, at the back table this time, with his lawyer Cass and 2 other men. He told them what he had come to tell them. Holt listened without expression, which was the behavior of a man who had known this was coming and had been deciding how to respond. "I'll fight it," Holt said. "You're entitled to," Lionel said. "That's how the law works." He rode back to the ranch. The arrest warrant came in 10 days, which was faster than Lionel had anticipated, and suggested that the territorial court had been watching Holt's activities independently for longer than just Lionel's investigation. 2 federal marshals from Santa Fe rode up to Copper Ridge to execute the warrant, accompanied by a territorial judge, who within the week had also issued orders voiding the 3 fraudulent land orders and sanctioning Judge Brennan, who resigned before the formal hearing. Fletcher Holt was arrested on a Wednesday and transported to Santa Fe for trial, accompanied by a great deal of paperwork and the testimony of Walter Greer and the 2 former county commissioners who had, once the weight of Holt's protection was removed, become remarkably willing to speak. Edna rode into Copper Ridge the following Monday to file the official re-registration of the Gentry Ranch deed under her name. Lionel rode with her. They went to the county land office, which now had a new acting recorder who had been appointed by the territorial court, and the process was completed within an hour, cleanly and without incident. She held the newly stamped copy of the deed in both hands when they came out into the street and stood there in the sunlight for a moment. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She looked at the deed and then at the street and then at him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she said. "I thought I would feel triumphant. Mostly I feel tired." "Tired is what comes after something that has taken everything you have," he said. "Triumphant comes later. Give it a few days." She folded the deed carefully and put it in her bag, the same bag she had sewn it into the lining of weeks ago, though this copy went into the main compartment because there was nothing left to hide it from. They had lunch at the small cafe in Copper Ridge, the first meal they had eaten in town since the afternoon of her arrival, and the contrast to that first day was so complete that it produced in Lionel a sharp and specific gratitude that he was not accustomed to feeling, and therefore noted with more than usual attention. Riding back to the ranch in the afternoon, he was quiet for a long time. Edna did not prompt him, which was characteristic, and eventually the quiet became the kind that required speaking into. "I need to go to Santa Fe," he said, "for the Holt trial, and to file my final reports, and to settle the terms of my ongoing assignment." "I know," she said. She was looking at the road ahead. "It'll take several weeks," he said. "I expected that," she said. "Edna," he said. She looked at him. "I don't want to go in a way that leaves things unresolved between us," he said. "I'm not constitutionally suited to that. I need to say directly what I mean." "Please do," she said. "I intend to come back," he said. "I'm telling you that clearly and without equivocation so that you can decide what to do with it." She held his gaze. "And what would coming back look like?" she said. "Specifically." "I would like it to look like not leaving again," he said, "if that's something you want." She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was thinking and not when she was feeling. He had learned to tell the difference. "You would leave the marshal's work," she said. "There's a deputy sheriff position opening in the county," he said. "I've known about it for 2 weeks. Closer work, less riding, more time in one place." "You looked into that," she said. "2 weeks ago," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then looked ahead at the road. And when she looked back, there was something in her face that was entirely unguarded and more affecting than anything she had shown him since the day in the saloon. "I want you to come back, Lionel," she said. "I want you to come back, and I want you to stay. And I want you to know that I am saying that with the full weight of knowing what I mean by it." He reached across from his horse to hers and took her hand, and they rode the last 4 miles to the ranch like that, which was not particularly practical on a rough road but was entirely necessary. He left for Santa Fe 3 days later. The weeks he was gone were the longest Edna had spent in some time, and she dealt with them the way she dealt with most things, which was by working. She had 5 years of deferred plans and no shortage of tasks to address them. She and Ruiz rode the entire property line twice, making a comprehensive list of what the fence situation required. She wrote to a cattle dealer in Texas she had corresponded with before her father died, inquiring about bull stock prices. She cleaned the spring in the northeast corner of the property, which took 2 full days and left her exhausted and satisfied. She wrote to Lionel twice. He wrote back 3 times, the letters arriving by mail rider and written in the careful, direct hand of a man who thought about what he said before he said it, which was exactly how she would have expected his letters to be. In the first letter, he described the opening of the Holt proceedings in Santa Fe and the mood of the courtroom, which he said reminded him of the particular tension of a moment before a storm, electric and compressed. In the second letter, he wrote about the city itself, its sounds and its bustle, and the way it felt compared to the high desert country south of Copper Ridge, and he said that the comparison was consistently unfavorable to Santa Fe. In the third letter, near the end of his time there, he wrote 1 sentence at the bottom after the news and practical information that stayed with Edna in a way that she read and reread until she had it from memory. "I find that I am not very interested in where I am when I could be thinking about where I intend to be." He came back on a Thursday in November, 5.5 weeks after he had left. She heard the horse coming down the south road and came out onto the porch, and he rode in through the gate on the same weathered roan he had ridden away on, looking trail dusty and tired, and considerably more welcome than anyone she had seen in 5 weeks. He swung down from the horse and tied it to the corral post and crossed the yard toward her, and she came down the porch steps toward him, and they met in the middle of the yard with neither of them saying anything immediately, which was not how either of them generally operated, but which felt entirely correct. He kissed her properly, with both of them dusty and the wind moving and Ruiz pointedly finding something to do in the barn, And when they stopped, she had her hands on the lapels of his coat, and he had his arms around her, and they stood there in the yard of the Gentry ranch in the November afternoon. "Holt," she said. "Convicted," he said. 3 counts of fraud, 2 counts of judicial bribery, 1 count of extortion. He won't be out of the territorial prison for at least 7 years. "Good," she said simply. "The county commission is being reorganized," he said, "and the position of county sheriff is open, not just the deputy position. They asked if I would be interested." She leaned back slightly to look at his face. "Sheriff," she said. "Based out of Copper Ridge," he said. "Which is 40 miles from here, but it's honest work, and it's work that means something in this county." "I know exactly how far Copper Ridge is," she said. 40 miles is rideable," he said, "on a good horse in good weather. And in bad weather." She said, "In bad weather a man needs somewhere to stay," he said, and his arms tightened fractionally around her. She looked at him for a long moment, at the dark eyes and the weathered face and the particular quality of his attention, which was, she had come to understand, one of his most essential characteristics. He paid attention to things. He paid attention the way her father had, with genuine interest and without performance, and she had known since approximately the 3rd day he was here that she was in serious trouble where this man was concerned. "Stay," she said. "Not just tonight, stay." "I intended to ask you properly," he said. "I had a plan for that." "What was the plan?" "It involved supper and considerably more preparation," he said. "We can still have supper," she said, "and you can still ask properly, but I wanted you to know the answer before you asked." He smiled then, the version of his smile that she had only seen a handful of times, the one that reached his eyes fully and changed his whole face into something less guarded and more extraordinary. "I brought a ring," he said. "I bought it in Santa Fe." She stared at him. "You bought a ring in Santa Fe," she said. "The 3rd week," he said. "I wasn't going to mention it until I had asked properly." "You bought a ring in the 3rd week," she said, "of 5.5 weeks." "I knew what I intended," he said. "It seemed practical to act on it." She laughed, which was a sound he had heard very rarely and which was worth considerable effort to produce. She laughed and then shook her head and then looked at him with her whole face open. "Ask me," she said. He let go of her and stepped back slightly and reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone that was dark red in the afternoon light, the color of the mesa above the ranch, and he took her hand and held it. "Edna Gentry," he said. "I intend to spend the next several decades finding out exactly how interesting you are, and I would consider it the best decision I have made in my entire life if you were willing to do the same with me. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and at his face and at the ring again. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He put the ring on her finger, which fit, which she noted, and which he said was something he had been quite careful about by paying attention to what size things she generally wore. And then she pulled him in by the lapels of his coat and kissed him again, thoroughly, and without any of the careful restraint of the previous weeks. They were married 6 weeks later, on a cold December morning in 1882, in the small church in the nearest town south of the ranch, attended by Ruiz and Pete and Mrs. Alcott from the hotel in Copper Ridge, who had been told by Lionel that she had been the one neutral and decent establishment in a corrupt town, and who had traveled 40 miles for the occasion with a fruitcake she had baked herself. Edna wore her best dress, which was dark green wool, and her hair up properly, and Lionel wore a suit he had purchased in Santa Fe because Edna had mentioned once, in passing, that her father had always believed a man should own a suit worth wearing. The ceremony was brief and direct, which suited both of them entirely. Lionel took the county sheriff position and spent 3 days a week in Copper Ridge and the other 4 at the ranch, which arrangement caused considerable discussion among the ranchers and townspeople of the county, who were not accustomed to officials who worked this way, but who found no fault with how the work was actually done, because Lionel was thorough and fair and showed no favoritism, and had rebuilt the reputation of the county law from its whole-terra low in a relatively short time. The ranch grew. The Texas bull stock arrived in February, and the spring calving was the best the Gentry ranch had seen in 5 years. Edna handled the ranch accounts and the correspondence and the daily operations with the same efficiency and intelligence she had applied to every other challenge life had given her. And the combination of her management and Lionel's additional labor on the days he was present produced results that Thomas Gentry would have recognized as exactly the expansion he had always planned. They hired 2 additional cowhands in the spring, a pair of brothers named Vila from a ranch to the east that had been sold up, and with 4 working hands the operation reached a scale that justified the investment in the new bull stock. The east pasture fence was rebuilt entirely. The spring in the northeast corner was cleared and improved with a simple stone cistern that Lionel and Ruiz built over 3 weekends. In the evenings, on the days Lionel was at the ranch, they fell into a pattern that felt so natural that Edna sometimes stopped in the middle of it to notice it with a kind of wondering gratitude. They cooked together, which had not been a deliberate decision, but had evolved from proximity and practicality. They read in the evenings in the main room, which still had Thomas Gentry's books on the shelves and had added several of Lionel's, including a volume on territorial law that he used for reference, and that Edna found herself reading with interest in the evenings when he was not there. They talked every night, about the work and about ideas, and about the county and about what they had read, and the conversations had the quality of conversations between 2 people who have found each other genuinely interesting, which, Edna thought, was perhaps the most fortunate thing a person could find in a life partner. In early summer, she told him over breakfast that she was expecting their first child. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was shock and delight, and a depth of feeling that he was not quite managing to contain in his usual measured way, and she thought that this was the most purely happy she had ever seen him. "When?" he said. "Early winter," she said. "December or thereabouts." He got up from the table and came around to her side and kissed the top of her head and then her forehead, and then held her face in his hands for a moment with a care that she felt in every part of her. "Your father should know this," he said softly. "He does," she said. "I think he does." The pregnancy was not easy in the middle months, when the summer heat was brutal, and the work of the ranch did not stop for anyone's physical discomfort, and Edna managed it with the same stubborn pragmatism she applied to everything, which drove Lionel to a level of concerned hovering that she found alternately touching and maddening. "I am not an invalid," she told him one evening when he had, for the 3rd time, attempted to intercept a bucket of water she was carrying to the kitchen garden. "I know you're not," he said, and took the bucket anyway. "Lionel, it's heavy," he said, "and I'm standing right here." She looked at him with exasperation that was undermined by the fact that she was smiling. "You're going to be an extraordinarily protective father," she said. "I intend to be," he said, setting the bucket down at the garden edge. "I have decided views on the subject." "Do you want a boy or a girl?" she asked, the question she had been waiting several weeks to ask because she had not been sure how to introduce it. He thought about it with his customary seriousness. "I want a child who grows up knowing they are completely safe," he said. "Boy or girl is a secondary consideration." She looked at him for a long moment. "Sometimes you say exactly the right thing," she said. "I'm improving with practice," he said. Their son was born on a Tuesday in December 1883, in the main bedroom of the ranch house, delivered by a capable midwife from the town to the south named Mrs. Domings, with Lionel present throughout in the hallway and at the door and finally in the room, because he had reached a point somewhere around the 4th hour where he had simply refused to stand in the hallway any longer, and Mrs. Domings had taken one look at his face and said there was no point fighting it. They named him Thomas James Sheridan, Thomas for Edna's father and James for Lionel's, and he arrived in the world with a full head of dark hair and the particular focused expression of a person who intends to pay careful attention to his surroundings, which Edna said was clearly his father's influence. Lionel held him for the first time in the gray morning light of December, sitting in the chair beside the bed where Edna lay exhausted but awake, and the expression on Lionel's face was something that Edna would carry with her for the rest of her life. He held the child with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, and his voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. "Hello, Thomas," he said. "I'm going to take very good care of you." The baby blinked at him with unfocused newborn eyes. "He looks like you," Lionel said to Edna. "He looks like himself," she said. "Give him a few days." Lionel looked at her over the baby's head, and the warmth in his dark eyes was the fullest and most unguarded she had ever seen it. "Thank you," he said. "For what specifically?" she said. "For everything since the saloon," he said. "For all of it." The following years built themselves on the foundation of that first year, with the steady accumulation of a life that is doing what it is supposed to do. Thomas grew into an energetic and curious child who followed his mother around the ranch, absorbing information about cattle and grass, and weather with a seriousness that made Ruiz smile every time he saw it, and who followed his father around when Lionel was at the ranch with the same focused attachment. Lionel's work as county sheriff evolved as the county evolved. The railroad came through in 1885 and brought with it new people and new complications and new demands on the law, and he navigated all of it with the combination of steadiness and intelligence that had characterized his work since before Edna knew him. The Holt case concluded in 1884 with the final disposition of Holt's assets, several of which, under the territorial restitution process, were redistributed to the landowners who had been defrauded, and the Gentry Ranch received a formal settlement that Edna used to pay off the last of the operating debt from the difficult years and invest in the East Pasture expansion she and her father had always planned. She had a ceremony of her own in the northeast corner of the property, private, just herself and Lionel and Thomas, who was 15 months old, and had to be held on a hip to prevent him from crawling directly into the spring cistern. She stood at the edge of the cleared spring and looked at the mesa above and said, quietly, the thing she had not been able to say at her father's graveside because she had been too occupied with the emergency of survival to grieve fully. Lionel stood beside her and did not say anything, which was the correct thing to do, and afterward he took her hand and they walked back to the house together with Thomas on his arm, and Edna felt something in her that had been tightly wounded for 3 years quietly release. In 1886, their daughter was born, delivered more smoothly than Thomas had been, in the same room and by the same Mrs. Domings, who had by this point become a regular visitor to the ranch and a person they trusted completely. They named her Clara Rose Sheridan, Clara for Lionel's mother and Rose for no particular person, but simply because Edna had always liked the name, and because it suited the particular quality of the child who arrived with it, smaller than Thomas had been and fiercely alert from the first hour of her life. Thomas was 2.5 and greeted his sister with the grave solemnity of a person receiving important information, touching her face with one careful finger while Lionel watched with his hand on Thomas's shoulder, and Edna watched both of them from the bed with the specific kind of happiness that fills all the available space. The ranch in those years was a living thing, growing and changing with the seasons and with the needs of the family and the work, and Edna was its heart in the way that her father had always meant her to be, not as a caretaker of something static, but as the driving intelligence of something in motion. The herd grew. The pastures improved. She hired a 4th full-time hand and managed the accounts with the precision of someone who had read the legal reference text and understood what ownership actually meant in all its practical and legal dimensions. Ruiz stayed. He was part of the ranch in the same essential way as the spring and the stone fireplace, and Thomas called him Tio Ruiz from the time he was old enough to talk, which Ruiz accepted with the dignified pleasure of a man who has found a second family in the work he loves. On a spring evening in 1887, 4.5 years after the afternoon in the Copper Ridge Saloon, Edna and Lionel sat on the porch of the ranch house as the sun went down behind the mesa, and the high desert turned all its colors at once, the red rock going purple, and the sage going silver, and the sky above the horizon layered in every shade between gold and green. Thomas was asleep inside. Clara was asleep in her cradle, which Lionel had built himself over the winter from pine he had hauled up from the south, with a care and precision that had taken him 3 separate evenings to get right. They sat together on the porch bench, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and the evening was so quiet they could hear the cattle in the far pasture and the wind in the sage, and somewhere far off, the call of a night bird beginning its work. "I want to tell you something," Edna said. "Tell me," he said. "I was so frightened that day in the saloon," she said. "I've never told you that." "I said I wasn't going to be frightened again, somewhere around the second night sleeping on the ground on the ride up, and I meant it, but when Fletcher Holt had that gun pointed at me, I was absolutely terrified." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You could tell." "Hands weren't shaking," he said, "but your voice was half a tone higher than it is when you're comfortable, I noticed." "Of course you did," she said. "It wasn't weakness," he said. "It was the appropriate response to someone pointing a gun at you." "I know that now," she said. "I couldn't admit it then because I needed everything I had to stay standing. But I've been thinking about it lately, about all the things I couldn't afford to feel until they were safe to feel, and fear is one of them." "What else?" he asked. She thought about it. "Grief," she said. "Real grief for my father, not the managed version I was running on for the first year. I cried for him properly the spring after Thomas was born. I don't know why then specifically. Maybe because Thomas being born made it fully real that your father wouldn't know him," Lionel said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly, "that's exactly it." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him in the way that had become as natural as breathing, his solidity against her side, the particular warmth and steadiness of him. "I was frightened too," he said. "When I walked into that saloon, you were 9 men in a room with iron drawn and 1 woman in the middle," he said. "It would have been foolish not to be. You didn't show it. Neither did you," he said. She smiled into his shoulder. "I was grateful for you then," she said, "and I am more so now every day." "As am I," he said, "for you." They sat like that as the last of the color left the sky and the stars began, the enormous desert sky filling from horizon to horizon with the particular density of stars that exists only far from city light, more stars than can be individually accounted for, a kind of astronomical excess that the high desert produces with complete indifference to whether anyone is watching. "Lionel," she said. "Edna," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "We built something good," she said. "We did," he said. "Your father's plans and your stubbornness and my jurisdictional authority," she laughed, the full real laugh. "That's an accurate accounting," she said. "And the ring I bought in the 3rd week," he said. "And the ring you bought in the 3rd week," she agreed. He kissed the top of her head. She settled more fully against him. Inside the house, Thomas slept in his narrow bed and Clara in her pine cradle, and the ranch breathed around them in the spring night air, the horses in the corral and the cattle in the pasture and the spring running quiet in the northeast corner, the best feature of the land. The stars came fully out. The night deepened. And Edna Gentry Sheridan sat on the porch of her father's ranch and felt, with the kind of specific and bone-deep certainty that does not arrive easily or often in one life, that everything that needed to be right was right. The land was safe and registered and growing. The man beside her was the one she had chosen and who had chosen her, with full knowledge on both sides and no illusions. Their children were healthy and safe, and sleeping in rooms of a house that belonged to them. The dark past was done with. The hidden dangers had been named and faced and defeated. The forbidden had become the foundation. The secrets that had nearly cost them everything had been exposed, and the justice that should have come sooner had come at last. And the sacrifice her father had made, those 3 years of grinding resistance that had cost him his health and his life, had not been in vain, because here was the ranch still standing, here was the spring still running, here was his daughter still alive and whole and sitting in the spring night with her family around her and her future, clearly and without question, ahead of her. "I love you," Lionel said. The words in his voice had the same quality as everything else he said, direct and fully meant. "I love you," she said, the same quality, the same weight. The night went on around them, quiet and enormous, full of stars. And that was enough and more than enough, and exactly what it was supposed to be.